2,500 years ago, Aristotle asked, is a city safer when everyone is equal or when the middle class is strong enough to balance rich and poor? Why do the rich so often grow arrogant, the poor resentful, but the middle keeps the peace? What makes the middle class the natural bridge between the powerful and the powerless? Aristotle believed that the personal virtue is found in the middle, not too much, not too little. Could the same idea hold true for politics? What is the relationship between the kind of military a city has and the kind of government it ends up with? Today, we are concluding Book 4 of Aristotle's Politics. These final chapters of Book 4 is a turning point in the whole discussion. Up to now, Aristotle has been classifying regimes, breaking down the different shades of democracy, oligarchy, and polity. But here he asks a deeper question. What actually makes a city stable? How does the government function in polities, which is one of the correct regimes identified by Aristotle? After trolling us in the previous chapters, saying, there is this very practical regime called polity that combines the best elements of everything and avoids the shortcomings. But we'll talk about polity one day when the time is right. But here, finally, in these chapters, Aristotle finally gets down to business to discuss what do we mean by polity and practical aspects of polities. If you enjoy these episodes, make sure to like, subscribe, and share. You can find this podcast on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And for more daily content, follow me on Instagram or send a DM at philosophy.everyday. And don't forget to check out the earlier episodes in this series if you want the full picture of Aristotle's politics. Alongside these solo episodes, I've got guest conversations coming up too. I've had one recently with Roman Yampolsky on AI and simulation theory. Check that out if you're interested, if you missed that one. So essentially, yes, this is a platform where I talk to either dead or alive philosophers. Okay, now back to Aristotle. Chapter 11 is one of Aristotle's clearest cases of connecting politics to his overall theory of golden mean principle of ethics. In this chapter, Aristotle makes one of his simplest but also sharpest points. He says, if you want a stable city, stable polity, don't look only to the rich or only to the poor. Look to the people in the middle. Every city, he says, is made up of three groups: the wealthy, the poor, and the middle. Aristotle originally came up with this idea of golden mean of virtue. So, for example, courage as a virtue is the middle point between cowardice and recklessness. Courage being the virtue because it's in the middle between these two extremes. Another example is generosity. It's the middle between stinginess and waste. Or we can also think about friendship. Friendship is the middle between conflict and flattery. The same rule, he says, applies to political life. We can extend this to the political life of the city. And that's where we move into the discussion around middle class, importance of middle class in stable societies, according to Aristotle. So a good city is not made up entirely of the rich who become arrogant, nor of the poor who become resentful. Aristotle says that if you build a city on either extreme, you don't get free citizens, instead you get masters and slaves. But when the middle class is numerous, you get people who know both how to rule and how to be ruled in turn. In other words, political golden mean is the middle class, according to Aristotle. So the extremes are dangerous. The very rich, the very powerful are raised in comfort, often in arrogance. From childhood, they learn how to command, but not how to obey. They don't know how to be ruled, only how to rule like masters, according to Aristotle. On the other side, the very poor grow up always being ruled, always being told what to do, never having any power, always dependent on others. They don't know how to rule, only how to be ruled like slaves, according to Aristotle. These are very strong words coming from Aristotle. So what kind of community do you get if these are the only two classes in the society, according to Aristotle? Not a city of free citizens, but a battlefield of masters and slaves in theory. So Aristotle says envy and contempt will dominate in these kinds of societies, in these kinds of settings. One side despises the other. The poor hate the rich for their arrogance. The rich hate the poor for their resentment. There is no civic friendship, no sense of shared belonging. But Aristotle says a city, by its nature, wants citizens who are roughly equal. So that's why Aristotle says the middle element matters. What he calls it middling element. Not the middle element, not the middle class, but the middling element, which we can roughly translate in today's terms as the middle class. So people who are neither very rich nor very poor, but they have enough to live decently, but not so much that they lose touch with reality. They lose touch with common people. They know how to rule, but they also know how to be ruled, depending on the context, depending on the situation. And if you watched my episode where I discussed Aristotle's idea of citizenship, that's what he also defines as a citizen. Citizen is someone who is ruling or being ruled, depending on the circumstance, depending on the context. They take share in deliberation and decision making of the community. So this is very directly related to his definition of citizenship. So Aristotle says that the best regimes are the ones where the middle class is numerous. Not everyone needs to be middle class. So he does not say that we should get rid of rich people or we should get rid of poor people. But enough people must exist in the middle to balance the extremes. So if the middle is strong, the city is strong. If the middle is weak, then power constantly swings back and forth between the rich and the poor, according to Aristotle. He also says that those swings open the door to tyranny. Sometimes the poor rise up and you get populist regimes, populist democracies. Sometimes the rich crush them and you get oligarchies. So both sides think they are ruling in the name of justice, but they are just ruling for themselves. When that cycle becomes unbearable, that constant conflicts, when the fighting goes too far, people start to prefer one strong man who promises to end the chaos. Aristotle even says that this explains why democracy, for all its flaws, is still preferable to oligarchy. Okay, the reminder that for Aristotle, both democracy and oligarchy are corrupt regimes in theory. So tyranny, democracy, oligarchy, these are considered corrupt. Monarchy, aristocracy, and polity are considered correct regimes. So he says democracy, with all its flaws, among these corrupt regimes, is still preferable to oligarchy. Because between the two corrupt regimes, according to Aristotle, democracy is less bad. Because at least the middle class is more numerous there compared to oligarchy. Because oligarchies shrink the middle and concentrate power in fewer hands over time, which makes tyranny almost inevitable, according to Aristotle. So Aristotle also says that the best regime is whichever gets closest to the middle. So in summary, basically Aristotle says that when the middle shrinks, politics might turn into war. The rich fund their own interests, the poor demand radical redistribution, and the center disappears. You can even see it online. Social media algorithms aren't built around the middle voice, if you notice. It is built around extremes, the loudest rich, the angriest poor, metaphorically speaking. Moving on to chapter 12. Aristotle says that a regime will only last if the part of the city that wants it to continue is stronger than the part that wants it to collapse. He says that a city is made up of two dimensions, quantity and quality. The poor might outnumber everyone, but if the powerful minority has the right qualities, wealth, arms, influence, connections, they can outweigh the numbers. That's how oligarchies hold power. A few hundred powerful men can dominate 500,000 if their resources and networks are strong enough. But then he says, the most lasting and stable regime happens when the middle class dominates. So oligarchy lasts when a small, well-armed, well-connected elite is so strong in quality that it beats its weakness in numbers. Populist democracy lasts when the majority is organized, wealthy enough to have time, and confident enough to push. The polity, the mixed regime, the most practical regime, according to Aristotle, lasts when the middling multitude is big enough to restrain both extremes and has the habit to do so. Because the middle doesn't plot against anyone, because they don't resent the rich or envy the poor, usually. They also don't inspire fear because they are not too powerful. The middle is by nature the natural mediator, the referee between extremes. And just like in ethics, where Aristotle says the middle path is the most trustworthy, in politics as well, according to Aristotle, it is the middle class that holds the city together. The middle does not burn with the arrogance of the very rich, and it does not burn with the rage of the very poor. So the middle can look up and look down without contempt or envy. It can be ruled and it can rule in turn, depending on the context, depending on the circumstances. It keeps the peace because it stands in between. According to Aristotle, where the middle is hollowed out, you get polarization. The rich and the poor start to see each other as enemies, and politics turns into open war. Okay, here let's take a moment to talk about this Aristotle's wordplay about middle class or middling element, so called, and where the origin is coming from. In the Nicomachean Ethics, the book, Aristotle's book about personal ethics, personal virtues, remember that politics is about societal ethics, the virtue of the society, how to govern society. But the Nicomachean Ethics is about personal life. What's the purpose of the life? How to attain happiness, what are the best ways to attain it, what are the good manners, what are the good virtues. So that's what the book is about. In the Nicomachean Ethics, virtue is a mean between excess and deficiency, as we explained in the beginning of the video. Courage sits between cowardice and recklessness. Generosity sits between stinginess and waste. The good life is a life of a right measure, usually found in the middle. In the same book, Nicomachean Ethics, justice has another cousin. It's called equity. So laws speak in generalities, but cases arrive as particulars. So the Greeks invented arbitration to solve this problem. So not a judge who applies the letter of the law, but an arbitrator who seeks the fair adjustment between two extremes. Now he maps that logic into the city. The middle class is the city's arbitrator. It sits between the rich and the poor and adjusts their competing claims. It is trusted because it does not terrify the poor and it does not threaten the rich. Okay, moving on to chapter 13. Chapter 13 up until the end of chapter 16, which is the last chapter of book 4, is a bit weird, at least the sequence and the speed. Because after the fire of chapter 12, with its big, almost poetic defense of middle class, chapters 13 up until chapter 16 feel like Aristotle suddenly turns into a policy advisor rather than theoretician. He goes from speaking about the soul of the city to obsessing about, fines for missing jury sessions and what should be the amount of the fine, how many judges should each regime has. So it's more practical compared to the other chapters where he laid out his claim about the importance of the middle class. Aristotle says that every constitution has its devices, little pretexts that either include people or shut them out. He lists 5 areas where this happens: the assembly, the offices, the courts, army, and surprisingly, exercise. Initially when I read that, I had no idea why he included exercise also as a pretext for including or excluding people. You can do exercise literally at your home or in the street with simple push-ups or pull-ups. You don't need to. Doesn't make sense when you say it's a pretext for including or excluding people. But for the Greeks, exercise was tied to the gymnasium, which wasn't just a place to lift weights. It was a central civic institution where citizens, mostly the well-off, who had leisure time, trained for war or they just socialized or received education. So access to the gymnasium, these institutions, these places was a marker of status. So controlling who could exercise was a way of controlling also who could participate in this key aspect of civic life. So going to gymnasium, which is gym in today's language, was a part of status. Not everyone had the time to do it back then. In oligarchies, the rich are fined heavily if they skip the assembly, the courts, or military training. Why? Because it forces them to take part, and the poor people can skip them without consequence. So the result is predictable. The wealthy dominate politics because there is a fine involved. So imagine there is a society of very rich people and the government fines them for not going to the gym or not taking part in the voting system. But Aristotle says that in democracies, it is the opposite. Instead of fines, you get pay. Citizens are literally paid to attend the assembly or sit on juries. So even the poor can afford to participate. This pulls power towards the majority. Just think about it today. If that was the case today, it would sound a bit wild. The government would pay everyone to participate in politics or elections if they wanted 100% enrollment, if that was a requirement. So, what is the conclusion about all of these discussions regarding oligarchies and democracies and the fine or being paid to participate in elections or politics? According to Aristotle, in a balanced regime, which he means the polity here, you need to mix both devices. Fine the wealthy people for neglecting their duties, but also pay the poor people so that they can afford to participate, so that they don't have to worry about surviving tomorrow if the farm doesn't yield enough returns. That way, both sides are in the game, according to Aristotle. A true polity, he says, should be made up of those who bear heavy arms, or in other words, those who do military training or spend some time in the army. Why? Because those are the people who actually defend the city. But he's also realistic here. He says you can't set the bar too high, or the ruling group will shrink into an oligarchy. So the trick here is to set property requirements just high enough to include a majority, but not so high that it excludes almost everyone except few people. And here's a very fascinating and interesting detail where he puts the cap of sociologist or historian. He says that in ancient Greece, the earliest constitutions after kingships were dominated by warriors, especially cavalrymen. Horses were the tanks of the ancient world. So you didn't need a massive army if your military force was made of cavalry. Speed and agility mattered more than sheer numbers. That's one of the reasons, for example, why Mongols were so successful. Some medieval historians inaccurately estimated that Mongols were just numerous, millions of cavalrymen. But that wasn't the case. They were just fast. They could strike one city one day and appear at another the next. But anyway, not to drift too much outside the topic. So Aristotle says that as cities grew larger over time, the heavy armed infantry became more numerous. So power shifted from cavalrymen to the heavy armed infantry, which is more numerous now compared to cavalry. So that's when the first regimes resembling polities appeared. So here Aristotle is quietly mapping some sort of a law of history. Regimes evolve at the military base as the military base of society changes. Cavalry power meant oligarchies. The heavy armed infantry power meant mixed constitutions, which is closer to polity or democracy, because it had to involve a lot of people, which also opened participation in politics, as they were also allowed to be in the military. And remember, participating in army, in military, was key status symbol back then. So if you are participating in army, if you go to wars, then you end up demanding participation in politics as well. Because if you don't, then it might be the case that you will also decline to participate in army. Next, Aristotle says that every regime has three key parts. And if those parts are healthy, the regime is healthy. If they are corrupt, the whole thing falls apart. So, what are those three parts? The first is deliberative part, the part that makes decisions. So here, it's about people who makes the big decisions about war, peace, laws, and alliances. Second part is the offices, which positions exist, how much power they hold, and how people are chosen for these specific offices. And lastly, the judicial part, who judges disputes and enforces the laws. So it's kind of early form of checks and balances system that Aristotle is laying out here. Let's start with the deliberative part and see what Aristotle is talking about. He shows how different regimes distribute decision making. In democracies, the people want equality. So they want everyone to decide everything. Sometimes this means all citizens rotate through offices by turn, so everyone gets a shot. uh, Other times, all citizens meet together to vote on war, peace, elections, or laws, while smaller offices handle routine details. And in the most extreme democracies, according to Aristotle, the assembly itself decides everything, and the offices just prepare proposals. Aristotle basically says this is democracy pushed to its limit, like the people acting as one giant ruler. Okay, what happens in oligarchies? In oligarchies, the opposite happens. Fewer people make decisions. Sometimes it is still wide enough to look moderate, like when many property owners qualify and still follow laws. Other times it's narrow, only a selected few rule, or power is hereditary, passing from father to son. In aristocracy and polity, instead, these arrangements are mixed. Some matters like war or audits are decided by the many. Other matters which require expertise are handled by officials, offices. Sometimes they are chosen by election, sometimes by lot. And you guessed it right if you watch previous episodes first, that Aristotle likes this balance, like prefers what happens in aristocracy and polity over what happens in democracy or oligarchy. The many decide the big direction, but the few handle technical details where expertise is required. Then he makes a very interesting observation going back to the topic of fines and pays, that practical incentives are really important in politics, according to Aristotle. I think this point sets him very, very far away from his teacher Plato. He's really talking about fines, giving people money, punishing people in the form of monetary amount. I think if you show this to Socrates or Plato, they would be horrified that you involve money to the realm of politics, community. But what Aristotle says is that no. This is really important part of life. Incentives are important. People look for incentives, so why not? You should also include them in the conversation regarding the ruling of the city, ruling of the community. So in that sense, he is very practical. Aristotle is very practical when he includes these considerations, monetary incentives, in the discussion of politics. Okay, he makes a very interesting observation. Practical incentives are really important. In democracies, the poor are paid to attend assemblies so that they can afford to participate. In oligarchies, the rich are fined if they skip duties to make sure they show up. And if you want a balanced regime in a polity, according to Aristotle, you have to combine both. Pay the poor so that they can come. They don't have to worry about surviving the next day, but fine the rich so that they also can't avoid. That way, both sides have a say in the game. Finally, Aristotle says in a healthy polity, the few may veto, but not pass laws on their own, while the many may pass, but not veto everything. Each side checks the other. That's how balance is kept in polities. So that's the conclusion about the deliberative part that Aristotle has been talking about. Now let's turn to the machinery of the government, the offices, the second part. Every regime has them, but they differ in number, scope, duration, and the methods of selection. And how you set up offices can make or break a city according to Aristotle. First, what counts as an office? An office means someone who has command, deliberation, and judgment over some part of the community. So, what are the variables? He lists them. How many offices exist? What authority each one has? How long they last? A year, shorter, longer, etc. And also reappointment. Can someone serve multiple times or only once? Selection. Who chooses, from whom, and by what method? Lot, election, or rotation. So this is where it gets interesting. It says in big cities, you can afford to have many specialized offices. One person for defense, one for markets, one for education, and so on. Citizens are plentiful, so each person can serve once in their lifetime, and every office is narrow, specialized, and focused. It is efficient. So it's basically the early theory of bureaucracy. As population grows, things get more complicated. That's why you need all these offices, and that's how we end up with a large, efficient bureaucracy, according to Aristotle. But in small cities, manpower is scarce. Aristotle compares their officials to spit lamp, one flame with many wicks branching out. One person may have to manage children, army, whatever, markets and festivals all at once. It is messy, but it is survival given the amount of people that exist in the community. And next, Aristotle also drills down on selection systems. He identifies three principles. Who selects? All citizens or some subset? From whom are they selected? Everyone or only certain groups? Rich, noble, educated. And by what method? Lot, election, rotation, or something else. And combining all those three principles, you get different modes of selection. When all citizens select from all citizens, that is democratic. When all select but from a restricted group, that is closer to polity. When some select from all, that is aristocratic. When some select from some, that is oligarchic. A mix of lot and election that creates hybrids, leaning one way or another depending on balance and situation. That's what happens in polity, according to Aristotle. Last item on our list is court system. Aristotle says if you want to understand how a regime works, don't just look at who rules or who holds the office, who selects whom, who elects whatever office, but you should also look at how disputes are handled, how disputes are judged in a city. So, what are the variables? Just like before, there are three. From whom judges are selected, everyone or only some, on what they decide, what kind of cases, in what manner they are selected, lot, election, or a mixture of both. Aristotle then lays out the options. If judges are selected from all citizens and decide on all matters, that is democratic. If judges are selected from a restricted group but still decide on all matters, that is oligarchic. If some are from all and some from a restricted group, that is aristocracy or polity. Then he lists the types of courts that exist in practice. There are courts of audit to review officials. There are courts for crimes against the community. There are courts on matters that affect the regime itself. There are courts for fines and penalties. There are courts for homicide, crime, divided into four types: intentional, accidental, disputed circumstances, and cases involving exiles returning. Specific courts for foreigners, where disputes between foreigners or between foreigners and citizens are handled. And finally, courts for petty disputes, where no massive jury is needed, but justice still matters. Like, for example, the cases on divorces, for example. Okay, what's the summary of all this discussion? If everyone sits in judgment, it is popular. If only the rich or the noble families sit in judgment, it is oligarchic. If it is a mix of both, depending on the case, it is a polity, which is more stable, according to Aristotle. Okay, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to like, subscribe, and share. You can also find this podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts alongside YouTube. And for more daily content, follow me on Instagram at philosophy.everyday. And don't forget to check out the earlier episodes in this series if you want the full picture of Aristotle's politics. Alongside these solo episodes, I've got guest conversations coming up too. I've had one recently with Roman Yampolsky on AI and simulation theory. Check that out if you're interested. Bye bye.